The ice-cold waters of the Delaware River lapped against the wooden boats as General George Washington stood in the bow, his weathered face etched with determination. It was December 25, 1776, and the Continental Army was about to make one of the most audacious moves in military history. The Revolution hung by a thread, and Washington knew that without a decisive victory, the cause of American independence would die with the coming winter. Behind him, 2,400 soldiers huddled in their makeshift boats, many without proper shoes, their feet wrapped in bloody rags. The Hessian mercenaries in Trenton had grown comfortable, believing the Americans were finished. They were wrong, as historian David Hackett Fisher noted in his acclaimed work Washington's Crossing. This moment represented not just a military maneuver, but a psychological turning point that would define the character of the emerging nation. The crossing took 9 hours, through a brutal nor'easter. Chunks of ice the size of millstones crashed against the boats, while snow and sleet pelted the men. Washington's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant James Monroe, who would later become the 5th president, nearly bled to death when ice shards sliced open his shoulder. Yet they pressed on, driven by Washington's unwavering resolve and the knowledge that failure meant the end of everything they had fought for. By 3 a.m, on December 26th, the entire force had crossed. They formed into 2 columns and began their 9-mile march to Trenton. The surprise attack that followed was devastating. In less than an hour, the Continental Army had captured nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners and killed or wounded over 100 more, while suffering only for casualties themselves too, of whom froze to death during the march. The victory at Trenton electrified the colonies. But Washington knew it was only the beginning. British General Lord Cornwallis was already marching south with 8,000 troops to crush this upstart rebellion once and for all. The stage was being set for an even more crucial confrontation that would test every ounce of Washington's tactical genius as the Continental Army celebrated their unexpected triumph. Washington was already planning his next move: intelligence. Reports indicated that Cornwallis would reach Trenton within days, and the British commander was not one to underestimate. The American position was precarious, strapped between the Delaware River and an approaching superior force. Most generals would have retreated across the river to fight another day. But Washington was not most generals. The morale boost from Trenton had been exactly what the army needed. Washington understood that one victory did not make a revolution. The enlisted men's terms were expiring on December 3rd, and many were ready to return home to their farms and families. He needed another stunning success, something that would not only secure military advantage, but also convince these citizen soldiers that their cause was worth continuing to fight for. In the candlelit tent that served as his headquarters, Washington studied his maps with his most trusted officers. The British had garrisons scattered throughout New Jersey. Intelligence suggested that Princeton, just 12 miles northeast of Trenton, was lightly defended. An audacious plan began to form in his mind, one that would require perfect timing, incredible luck, and the kind of bold leadership that separates legendary commanders from forgotten ones. The die was cast. In just days, the fate of the American Revolution would be decided not in the halls of Congress or the salons of European diplomats, but on the frozen fields around a small college town in New Jersey. Lord Charles Cornwallis spurred his horse forward as the British column stretched for miles along the muddy New Jersey roads. It was January 1st, 1777, and the veteran general was supremely confident that he would crush Washington's ragtag army before the day was through. Behind him marched 8,000 of Britain's finest troops, including battle-hardened regulars who had fought in Europe and seasoned Hessian units thirsting for revenge after their humiliation at Trenton. Cornwallis had good reason for his confidence. His intelligence network had reported that Washington's force numbered fewer than 5,000 men, many of them militia with expiring enlistments. The Americans were trapped with their backs to the swollen Delaware River, and escape routes were limited. In the general's mind, this would be the day the rebellion died. He would be the man who delivered the final blow. What Cornwallis didn't know was that Washington had spent days preparing for exactly this confrontation. The American commander had positioned his men along a sun-pink creek, seemingly modest waterway that would become the site of one of the most crucial holding actions in military history. Every bridge had been fortified. Every ford covered by artillery pieces under the command of Captain Alexander Hamilton, the young officer who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury. As the morning mist lifted from the creek, advance elements of Cornwallis's army came into contact with American skirmishers. The British pushed forward confidently, expecting to sweep aside the colonial resistance with their usual efficiency. Instead, they found themselves facing withering fire from concealed positions. Colonel Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen, many of them frontiersmen who could put a bullet through a playing card at 200 yards, picked off British officers with deadly precision. The fighting intensified as Cornwallis committed more troops to what he assumed would be a quick. British regulars in their distinctive red coats advanced in perfect formation, only to be shattered by concentrated artillery fire from the high ground beyond the creek. 3 separate assaults were thrown back with heavy casualties, and as the winter afternoon began to fade, even Cornwallis began to realize that his enemy was more formidable than anticipated. According to accounts preserved in the New Jersey Historical Society archives, the British general stood on a hilltop overlooking the battlefield as darkness fell, watching American campfires twinkle along the creek line. "We've got the old fox safe now," he reportedly told his staff officers. "We'll go over and bag him." In the morning, it was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his military career, unknown to Cornwallis. Washington was already implementing the most audacious deception of his career. As British soldiers settled into their camps, confident that dawn would bring victory, American troops were quietly banking their fires with green wood to keep them burning through the night. Wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and the Army's baggage train was secretly moved to the rear. The plan Washington had conceived was breathtakingly risky. While a skeleton force remained behind to maintain the illusion of a full encampment, the bulk of the Continental Army would execute a night march around Cornwallis's left flank. Their destination was Princeton, where a smaller British garrison offered the possibility of another stunning victory. If successful, they would not only capture valuable supplies and prisoners, but also position themselves behind Cornwallis's main force. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped below freezing, and the muddy roads began to harden. This was exactly what Washington had hoped for. The frozen ground would support his artillery and muffle the sound of marching feet. In a few hours, he would either pull off one of the greatest tactical surprises in military history or lead his army into a trap from which there would be no escape. At 1 o'clock in the morning on January 3, 1777, the Continental Army began what military historians would later call one of the most daring night marches in the annals of warfare. General Washington rode at the head of his column, wrapped in his blue military cloak, as 2,400 men followed him into the frozen darkness. Behind them, carefully maintained campfires continued to burn along a sun-pink creek, creating the illusion that the entire American force remained trapped and waiting for Cornwallis's morning assault. The route Washington had chosen was treacherous. Under the best of circumstances, but in the dead of winter, it became a test of human endurance. The Quaker Road and Sawmill Road formed a circuitous path that would take them around the British left flank. But the journey would cover nearly 18 miles through terrain that could easily become impassable if the weather changed. Every step had to be taken in near complete silence. A single British patrol could uncover the deception and doom the entire enterprise. Leading the advance guard was General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish-born physician who had served with Washington. During the French and Indian War, Mercer's men moved like ghosts through the winter landscape, using hand signals and whispered commands to navigate by starlight. Behind them came the main body of troops, organized into 2 parallel columns to speed their movement. Artillery pieces, including the cannons that had proven so decisive at Trenton, were pulled by horses whose hooves had been wrapped to deaden sound. The cold was brutal. Many soldiers still lacked proper winter clothing. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air that could potentially give away their position to alert sentries. Officers passed word down the line that any man who made unnecessary noise would be immediately court-martialed. The stakes could not have been higher. Discovery meant not just military defeat, but likely the end of the revolution itself. As the column wound through the New Jersey countryside, Washington's mind raced with calculations and contingencies. Intelligence reports suggested that Princeton was defended by fewer than 2,000 British troops, primarily raw recruits and garrison soldiers who would not be expecting an attack. However, the town also served as a crucial supply depot and communications hub. Its capture would not only provide much-needed resources for the Continental Army, but also cut Cornwallis's lines of communication with his other garrisons. The march progressed with agonizing slowness as the army navigated frozen streams and treacherous hillsides. Several times, artillery pieces became stuck in ice-covered ruts, requiring dozens of men to manhandle them free while maintaining absolute silence. Washington himself dismounted frequently to check on his men, knowing that their confidence in his leadership was perhaps the most valuable asset he possessed. Around 4 in the morning, just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, disaster nearly struck. A British patrol appeared on a parallel road, close enough that the Americans could see their scarlet uniforms in the growing light. For several terrifying minutes, it seemed certain that the deception would be discovered. However, the British soldiers were focused on their own route and failed to notice the shadows moving through the trees nearby. By 5:30, Mercer's advance guard had reached the outskirts of Princeton. The town lay quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, with only a few scattered lights visible in windows. British sentries walked their posts with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves to be far from any threat. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours they would be fighting for their lives against an enemy who had seemingly materialized out of the winter darkness. Washington called his officers together for final instructions as the army prepared to deploy for battle. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Mercer would attack from the southwest while Washington led the main assault from the west. The element of surprise would be crucial once the alarm was raised. British reinforcements from nearby garrisons could arrive within hours. Dawn was breaking over. Princeton, as General Hugh Mercer led his 350 men across the frost-covered fields toward the town's outskirts. The Scottish physician-turned-soldier had volunteered for this most dangerous assignment, knowing that his advance guard would bear the brunt of any British resistance. Behind him, spread across the frozen landscape, came the rest of Washington's army in a formation that would have impressed European military observers with its precision and discipline. The first shots rang out at approximately 7 o'clock, when Mercer's men encountered a British foraging party near the Thomas Olden House. The enemy soldiers, members of the 17th Regiment of Foot under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, had been collecting supplies when they stumbled upon the approaching Americans. What began as a chance encounter quickly escalated into a vicious firefight that would determine the fate of the entire operation. Mawhood was no inexperienced garrison commander, but a veteran officer who had fought in numerous European campaigns. Upon realizing he faced a significant American force, he immediately began deploying his troops in standard British battle formation. His men moved with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers, forming neat lines and preparing to deliver the devastating volleys that had broken enemy formations from Lexington to Long Island. Mercer's Continentals, many of them veterans of the Trenton victory just a week earlier, advanced with fixed bayonets across the open ground. The morning air crackled with musket fire as both sides exchanged volleys at close range. The British, fighting from a slight elevation near the William Clark House, initially held the advantage. Their disciplined fire began to tell on the American ranks, and several of Mercer's officers fell wounded in the opening minutes of the engagement. The crucial moment came when British soldiers launched a bayonet charge that caught the Americans at their most vulnerable. Mercer himself, conspicuous on horseback, became a primary target for enemy fire. A British soldier thrust his bayonet into the general's abdomen, while another struck him down with a musket butt. As their beloved commander fell mortally wounded, many of his men began to waver and fall back toward the woods. Washington had been observing the battle from a nearby ridge when he saw Mercer's line beginning to collapse. Without hesitation, he spurred his white charger directly toward the fighting, calling for reinforcements to follow him. Captain John Fleming of the Virginia Militia later recalled in letters preserved by the Virginia Historical Society that Washington rode directly between the opposing lines, seemingly oblivious to the musket balls whistling around him. "With us, my brave fellows," Washington shouted to Mercer's retreating men. "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." His presence on the battlefield had an electrifying effect. Soldiers who had been falling back suddenly steadied themselves and began to reform their ranks. The sight of their commander-in-chief sharing their danger transformed what could have been a rout into a renewed assault. The tide of battle shifted decisively. When Washington brought up his artillery, Captain Alexander Hamilton's guns, which had proven so effective at Trenton, were quickly positioned to rake the British lines with deadly grapeshot. The concentrated fire tore gaps in Mohood's formation, and the British regulars, who had seemed on the verge of victory moments before, suddenly found themselves under devastating attack from multiple directions. Mahood, recognizing that his position had become untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the town center. His troops conducted the retreat with typical British discipline, but they were clearly shaken by the ferocity of the American assault. Many of his soldiers, particularly the younger recruits who had never faced such determined opposition, began to break ranks and flee toward the perceived safety of Princeton's buildings. The British commander's retreat exposed another enemy force that had been positioned in the town itself. As Mahood's men fell back through Princeton's streets, they became entangled with militia units and supplies wagons, creating chaos that the pursuing Americans were quick to exploit. What had begun as an orderly tactical withdrawal was rapidly degenerating into a rout. The streets of Princeton erupted into chaos as British soldiers fled through the narrow lanes between colonial houses, pursued by vengeful American troops who remembered their humiliations during the long retreat across New Jersey. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood's disciplined withdrawal had collapsed into something approaching panic as his men sought shelter wherever they could find it. Many of the younger soldiers facing combat for the first time abandoned their weapons and equipment in their desperate flight toward the perceived safety of New Brunswick. Washington pressed his advantage with the instincts of a natural battlefield commander. He divided his forces to prevent any organized British resistance from forming while maintaining enough concentrated power to overwhelm isolated pockets of defenders. Captain William Washington, the general's younger cousin, led a mounted charge that scattered a group of British infantry attempting to rally near the Princeton Inn, while other American units moved systematically through the town to flush out hidden enemies. The most dramatic moment of the street fighting occurred when a group of British soldiers barricaded themselves inside Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey. The structure, built of sturdy stone, offered excellent defensive positions. The trapped soldiers seemed prepared to make a determined stand. American artillery, under Captain Hamilton, was quickly brought forward, and a single cannon shot through the building's wall convinced the defenders to surrender rather than face destruction. Among the prisoners taken at Nassau Hall were several officers whose capture would prove strategically valuable. More importantly, the building served as a supply depot containing military stores that the Continental Army desperately needed. Barrels of gunpowder, thousands of musket cartridges, and warm winter clothing were seized resources that would prove crucial for the challenges ahead. The human cost of the battle was becoming apparent. As American soldiers moved through the captured town, General Hugh Mercer lay dying in the Thomas Clark House, his wounds too severe for the primitive medical care available. The beloved Scottish physician who had served his adopted country with such distinction would succumb to his injuries within days, becoming one of the Revolution's most mourned martyrs. His sacrifice, however, had not been in vain. The victory at Princeton was complete. British casualties numbered nearly 400 killed, wounded, or captured, while American losses totaled fewer than 40 men. More significant than the raw numbers was the psychological impact of the defeat on British morale throughout New Jersey. Reports reaching London described a colonial rabble that had somehow outmaneuvered and outfought professional European troops on 2 consecutive occasions. The myth of British military invincibility, so carefully cultivated over decades of imperial expansion, is crumbling before the world's eyes as Washington consolidated his victory. Urgent reports arrived from his rearguard still maintaining the deception at Assunpink Creek. Lord Cornwallis had discovered the American ruse at dawn and was now marching his 8,000 troops north toward Princeton with all possible speed. The British general was reportedly in a towering rage, realizing that he had been completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he had dismissed as a provincial amateur. The tactical situation required immediate decision-making. Washington's army, exhausted from their all-night march and the morning's battle, could not hope to stand against Cornwallis's superior numbers in open combat. Yet the strategic opportunity was too valuable to abandon. The British supply depot at New Brunswick lay just 18 miles northeast, weakly defended and containing military stores worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Washington's officers were divided in their council. Some argued for an immediate retreat to the safety of the Delaware River before Cornwallis could trap them again. Others, emboldened by their recent successes, urged an advance on New Brunswick that could potentially end British resistance in New Jersey entirely. The decision would require all of Washington's wisdom and understanding of his army's capabilities. Standing in the captured town square of Princeton, surrounded by evidence of his stunning victory, Washington weighed options that would determine not just the immediate fate of his army, but potentially the entire course of the revolution. The next few hours would test his leadership in ways that no previous challenge had done. General George Washington stood in the center of Princeton's town square, his blue military cloak whipping in the cold January wind as he contemplated a decision that would define his legacy as a military commander. Around him, Continental soldiers were systematically looting British supply wagons, while others herded captured prisoners into makeshift holding areas. The sweet taste of victory filled the air, but Washington knew that Lord Cornwallis and 8,000 British troops were racing north to exact terrible vengeance for this humiliation. His senior officers had gathered around him, their faces reflecting the same mixture of elation and apprehension that Washington himself felt. Colonel John Cadwalader, whose Pennsylvania militia had performed magnificently during the street fighting, argued forcefully for an immediate advance on New Brunswick. "Sir," he declared, "the British magazines there contain enough supplies to sustain our army through the entire winter. We may never have such an opportunity again." General Nathanael Greene, Washington's most trusted subordinate, counseled caution. The Rhode Islander had studied the tactical situation with his characteristic thoroughness and concluded that the risks outweighed the potential rewards. "Our men have been marching and fighting for over 24 hours, he pointed out. "They are exhausted, and Cornwallis will be upon us within hours. We should withdraw to defensible positions in the hills and preserve our army for future operations."
Washington
listened to both arguments while his mind calculated distances, marching times, and the complex logistics of military movement. His intelligence network had confirmed that New Brunswick was indeed lightly defended, but it had also reported that British reinforcements from New York were already moving south. The window of opportunity was narrowing with each passing minute, and a wrong decision could undo everything they had accomplished. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the debate. As a dust-covered courier arrived with urgent dispatches from the rearguard, Cornwallis had discovered the deception at Assunpink Creek at dawn and was pushing his troops north at a punishing pace. British advance elements could reach Princeton within 3 hours, and the main body would follow shortly thereafter. Time was running out, as recorded in the papers of General Henry Knox. Washington's decision-making process at this crucial moment demonstrated the strategic thinking that separated him from his contemporaries. Rather than choosing between the two extreme options presented by his subordinates, he crafted a third alternative that maximized advantages while minimizing risks. The army would indeed advance toward New Brunswick, but not to attack the British stronghold directly. Instead, Washington ordered his forces to take up positions in the defensible hill country between Princeton and New Brunswick, effectively cutting Cornwallis's communications with his supply base while avoiding a direct confrontation with superior numbers. This positioning would force the British to either attack uphill against prepared defenses or abandon their plans for offensive operations in New Jersey. Either outcome would serve American strategic interests. The withdrawal from Princeton began immediately, with advance elements moving northeast, while rearguards prepared defensive positions to delay Cornwallis's pursuit. American artillery, now reinforced with captured British guns, was positioned to cover the main roads leading out of town. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, which had performed so brilliantly during the morning's fighting, took up positions that would allow them to rake any pursuing column with devastating enfilade fire. Washington's strategic masterstroke became apparent as his army settled into their new positions. From the hills overlooking the main roads to New York, the Continental Army controlled the flow of British communications and supplies throughout central New Jersey. Cornwallis, arriving in Princeton to find only empty buildings and abandoned equipment, faced an impossible tactical situation. His army was strung out along vulnerable supply lines while his enemy occupied commanding terrain that would be costly to assault. The psychological impact of Washington's maneuver extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of the victories at Trenton and Princeton spread throughout the colonies like wildfire, kindling the revolutionary spirit that had seemed nearly extinguished just weeks before. Militia units that had disbanded began to reform, and colonial assemblies that had been considering accommodation with Britain suddenly found new resolve to continue the struggle. More importantly, the European powers that had been watching the American rebellion with detached interest began to reassess their positions. French agents reported to Versailles that Washington had demonstrated genuine military competence, while Spanish officials noted that British prestige had suffered serious damage. The diplomatic implications would prove every bit as significant as the tactical victories themselves. The fires of revolution, which had flickered so dimly just weeks before, now blazed across the American colonies with renewed intensity. News of Washington's stunning victories at Trenton and Princeton traveled faster than any military dispatch carried by merchants, travelers, and the colonial postal system to every corner of the rebellion. In taverns from Boston to Charleston, patriots who had despaired after the disasters of New York found new hope in their cause, while loyalists who had expected the rebellion to collapse quietly began to reconsider their positions. The strategic impact of the Princeton campaign extended far beyond the immediate military gains. By establishing the Continental Army in the hills of central New Jersey, Washington had effectively neutralized British control over vast areas that had been considered pacified. Lord Cornwallis, facing the impossible task of maintaining extended supply lines while his enemy controlled the high ground, was forced to abandon most of his advanced positions and concentrate his forces around New Brunswick and Perth Amboy. This withdrawal had profound political consequences throughout New Jersey, where many colonists had sworn loyalty to the crown following the British successes of late 1776. Now, with American forces once again active in their neighborhoods and British protection suddenly unavailable, these same individuals found themselves in an extremely precarious position. Many chose to flee with the retreating British forces, rather than face potential retribution from their patriot neighbors. The transformation in Continental Army morale was perhaps the most significant long-term result of the Princeton victory. Soldiers who had been ready to abandon the cause on December 31st now eagerly extended their enlistments to continue serving under Washington. The general's personal courage during the battle, particularly his dramatic appearance between the opposing battle lines, had elevated him to mythical status among his troops. They had witnessed their commander risk his life alongside the humblest private soldier, and this shared experience created an unbreakable bond of loyalty. European observers took careful note of these developments, particularly in the courts of France and Spain, where ministers were already contemplating potential advantages to be gained from British difficulties in America. The Marquis de Lafayette, writing to his family as preserved in French Foreign Ministry archives, observed that Washington had demonstrated a combination of strategic vision and personal courage that marks him as a commander worthy of serious consideration. Such assessments would prove crucial when formal alliance negotiations began. The British government's response revealed the extent to which the Princeton campaign had damaged their strategic position. King George III, upon receiving reports of Cornwallis's failure, reportedly flew into one of his famous rages and demanded an immediate escalation of military efforts in America. Additional regiments were ordered to sail from Britain and Ireland. While German princes were approached about providing more mercenary troops to supplement the forces already committed, however, these reinforcements would take months to arrive and organize, providing Washington with a precious breathing space to rebuild and reorganize his army. The captured supplies from Princeton, combined with the boost to Patriot morale throughout the colonies, allowed the Continental Army to establish winter quarters in Morristown with confidence that they could survive until spring brought new opportunities for offensive operations. The human cost of the campaign had been remarkably light for such decisive results. American casualties for both battles totaled fewer than 70 men. While British and Hessian losses exceeded 600 killed, wounded, and captured, more importantly, the battles had proven that European professional soldiers were not invincible. When faced with determined American resistance under competent leadership, General L.Q. Mercer's death became a rallying cry for the Patriot cause. With his sacrifice commemorated in newspapers and broadsides throughout the colonies, the Scottish physician who had given his life for his adopted country represented the international character of the American Revolution, demonstrating that the cause of liberty transcended national boundaries and attracted supporters from around the world. As winter deepened and both armies settled into their respective quarters, the strategic situation had been fundamentally altered. The British still controlled New York City and several other coastal enclaves, but their ability to project power into the American interior had been severely compromised. Washington's army, though still small and under-equipped by European standards, had proven its ability to strike effectively against superior forces when conditions were favorable. The Battle of Princeton, fought on that frigid January morning in 1777, had done more than secure a tactical victory. It had resurrected the Revolution itself. In the frozen fields around a small college town, George Washington had transformed himself from a retreating general into the symbol of American resistance. The war was far from over, but after Princeton, few doubted that it would continue until final victory or ultimate defeat. The die had been cast, and there would be no turning back.